The office door slammed behind me, its reverberating thud slicing through the murmur of distant conversations. I froze, my fingers lingering on the cold metal handle. The once familiar hum of the workplace now felt suffocating, charged with an energy I couldn't escape. Emma was standing by the coffee machine, her back straight and posture perfect, a careful mask of elegance that barely hid the storm brewing underneath. Her eyes were locked onto mine, her lips pressed into a thin, almost predatory line. Across the room, Zoe was perched on the edge of a desk, her bright, youthful energy filling the space like a breeze. She caught my gaze and gave me that playful smile she always did, the one that made my heart race. She was beautiful in a way that felt innocent, unguarded, and yet there was something undeniably sharp in the way she held herself. I took a step forward, and suddenly, the air between them seemed to grow thick with unspoken tension. Both of them, two completely different women, yet both vying for my attention. It wasn't just about flirtation anymore. No, this had turned into something much deeper. I could feel their rivalry seeping into every corner of the room, their carefully controlled facades cracking at the edges. I hadn't expected any of this, certainly not for a man my age, with the gray creeping into my hair and the weight of experience pressing on my shoulders. Yet, here I was, caught in the eye of a storm that was quickly growing too large to ignore. The question lingered in the air like a cloud. How had this even happened? What had started as an innocent office flirtation had become a deadly game of strategy, with no clear path to victory. As I scanned their faces, I knew one thing for sure. This was no longer about me choosing between them. This was about survival. My survival. It had all started so innocently, small, fleeting moments that I convinced myself were nothing more than light office banter. Emma had been my colleague for a year now, sharp, polished, and always in control. I'd always admired her from a distance, respecting her intelligence and the quiet way she commanded a room. There had been times, quiet moments, where our conversations lingered longer than they should have. She'd laugh at my jokes, just a little too long, her fingers brushing mine when she passed me a report. But I never took it seriously. After all, I was just another middle-aged man to her, someone to have a coffee with during the slow afternoons, nothing more. Then Zoe came in, young, brash, and undeniably magnetic. She was everything Emma was not, loud, vibrant, always filling the room with her infectious energy. At first, I thought she was just another intern, another face in the crowd. But then she began to catch my eye, and I couldn't deny that the attention was mutual. Every time I walked into the break room, there she was, her smile as wide as the morning sun. Her laughter followed me like a shadow, and somehow, it felt like I was more alive around her. I tried to dismiss it at first. What was a beautiful college student interested in me for? But she kept looking at me like she saw something more than the worn-down middle-aged man I saw in the mirror. The night of the office event, the one that was supposed to be just a casual drink, it all came to a head. Zoe had entered, dressed in that tight red dress that hugged every curve of her body. It wasn't the way she looked, though she looked stunning, that struck me. It was the way everyone in the room turned to look at her, Emma included. I saw the flicker in Emma's eyes as Zoe walked in. It was brief, but unmistakable, a subtle flash of discomfort, of something deeper. At that moment, I knew I had miscalculated. What I had thought was harmless flirtation, what I had convinced myself was just a harmless exchange of glances, had become a silent war. Emma was no longer my friendly office companion. She was a woman betrayed, by me, by her own assumptions. And then Zoe, like a hurricane, had moved into my orbit, her touches lingering, her voice just a little too soft when she addressed me. She knew exactly how to make me feel special, wanted, noticed. It wasn't until after the event that Emma had cornered me in the hallway. I thought we had something, Emma had said, her voice trembling with something raw. Hurt, maybe betrayal, maybe both. The vulnerability in her voice shocked me, more than I cared to admit. Was I just some distraction to you? A placeholder until she showed up? I hadn't known what to say. It wasn't that I hadn't noticed Emma's feelings. It was just that I had never bothered to acknowledge them, to give them weight. I hadn't been paying attention, hadn't realized the quiet way she had come to care. My silence, my indecision, had been a betrayal in itself. She wasn't just an office mate. She was someone who had been quietly putting pieces of herself into the space we shared. And I had ignored it all. I never meant for it to be like this, I muttered, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to fix what had been broken in that moment. But I could see it in her eyes. Her walls were going up. She had been hurt, and it was a pain I had caused without realizing the consequences. As I left the office that night, the weight of the confrontation with Emma still hung over me like a storm cloud. It wasn't just the guilt that gnawed at me. It was the realization that I had been blind to everything. I had been floating through life, taking things as they came, enjoying the attention, but never fully acknowledging the people who had quietly invested in me. I replayed Emma's words over and over in my mind. Was I just a placeholder? The pain in her voice cut through me in a way I hadn't anticipated. And then there was Zoe, with her wide-eyed idealism and youthful energy. She had caught me off guard, and in doing so, had pulled me into something I wasn't ready for. But the deeper I thought about it, the more I realized something important. This wasn't about Emma or Zoe. It wasn't even about what I felt for them, or the choices they were making. This was about me, about how I had been living my life, without fully understanding the value I brought to the table. I had spent years working in this office, clocking in and out, playing the role of the seasoned professional, the calm and composed colleague. But now, I saw myself differently. I wasn't just a middle-aged man caught in the middle of a love triangle. I was someone who had spent decades honing patience, understanding human nature, and knowing when to act and when to wait. I wasn't impulsive, I wasn't reckless. I could outlast this. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my quiet approach to life had always been my strength. While Emma and Zoe clashed with each other, their emotions like open books, I had learned to sit back, observe, and make decisions with careful consideration. My age, my experience, it had taught me how to navigate these kinds of situations without rushing in. I wasn't desperate for affection. I wasn't looking for approval. This was a game of patience, and I had the advantage. I could stay calm in the storm. Where they floundered, I could stand steady. They were driven by emotions, impulses, jealousy, and pride, things I had long since learned to keep in check. So, I started to think. The moment had arrived for me to take control, to step into my own power. I wasn't going to pick a side. I wasn't going to be another pawn in their game. Instead, I was going to use my quiet strength to orchestrate the endgame. I wasn't some object to be fought over. I was a man who had lived enough to know what was worth fighting for, and it wasn't this petty rivalry. Days turned into weeks, and what had initially seemed like a simple office flirtation began to spiral. I had hoped that with time, the tension between Emma and Zoe would subside, but it only grew sharper. The subtle digs, the passive-aggressive comments, the glances exchanged when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Everything was becoming unbearable. What had started as a personal conflict was now spilling into the workplace, making things uncomfortably clear. This wasn't just about me anymore. Their rivalry was starting to poison everything. It wasn't just the office politics that were shifting. I was beginning to notice changes in my own work. Emma, the professional I'd once admired, had started taking risks, making decisions that seemed calculated to provoke a reaction from Zoe. The once calm work environment was becoming increasingly tense. Meetings were disrupted, and emails, once polite, now had a biting edge. Every decision felt like a battleground, every interaction loaded with unspoken words. Zoe, too, had changed. The carefree college student I once found charming now seemed distant, her bright demeanor masking an undercurrent of frustration. She started to make pointed comments about the office culture, about how outdated everything seemed, how we were stuck in our old ways. It wasn't just rebellion for the sake of rebellion. Zoe was challenging everything, from management to seniority. She wasn't just trying to make her mark. She was trying to dismantle the structures that had held the office together for years. The stakes were rising, and I was right in the middle of it. What had begun as two women vying for my attention was now threatening the fabric of the entire office. Emma's power and influence in the company were undeniable, but her position was becoming increasingly fragile, torn between her rivalry with Zoe and her own ambition. Zoe, on the other hand, had the fire and drive of youth on her side, but with it came impulsiveness and a lack of experience. If left unchecked, her rebellious streak could lead to more than just office drama. It could tear apart years of work that had been carefully built. The tension was beginning to seep into everything. The team, once united, now divided into factions. A once thriving environment had turned toxic, with gossip filling the air like an ever-present cloud. People began whispering behind closed doors, their loyalties shifting, uncertain who to trust. Even the clients were starting to notice. Sales were slipping, meetings were less productive, and the morale in the office had never been lower. I couldn't help but feel responsible for all of this. If I hadn't let my own desires get in the way, maybe things would have been different. But now I was in too deep. My decisions had consequences, not just for me, but for everyone I worked with. The weight of it all began to press down on me. The realization that this wasn't just about choosing between Emma and Zoe. It was about protecting the very structure I had spent years working in. And now, it was becoming clear. If I didn't do something soon, everything I had worked for, the stability, the respect, the career I had built, was going to come crashing down. And the worst part? Neither Emma nor Zoe seemed to notice the damage they were causing. They were too consumed by their jealousy, their egos, their need to win. They didn't realize that they were pushing me toward a precipice, one that would require a difficult decision, a decision that might change everything. But there was a new understanding growing within me. It wasn't just about playing their game anymore. I was going to turn the tables. The stakes had escalated beyond what they realized, and now it was my turn to control the narrative. The chaos at the office was undeniable, but rather than succumbing to the pressure, I found clarity in the mess. The walls had been closing in, but now, I saw them as opportunities. The mistakes I had made with both Emma and Zoe were regrettable, but they weren't irreversible. The game was still mine to play, but I had to be smart, meticulous. I needed to reassert control, not just over Emma and Zoe, but over myself. The first step was regaining my confidence. I began isolating myself from the growing tension in the office, focusing solely on my work. The noise around me, the gossip, the jealous stares, they were distractions. I couldn't afford to let them pull me down any longer. Instead of reacting to Emma's cutting remarks or Zoe's provocations, I learned to turn my attention inward, finding strength in my own discipline. In the next few days, I took a step back from both women, distancing myself emotionally. I needed to appear neutral, even aloof. They would think they had control over me, that they could manipulate my actions based on their whims. But I wasn't the same man I had been when this all started. I had a plan, and I knew exactly how to execute it. I began paying closer attention to the dynamics between Emma and Zoe. It became clear that their rivalry wasn't just rooted in their feelings for me. It was about power, position, and ego. Emma, despite her grace and intelligence, was losing her grip. The stress was starting to show. Her usual confident demeanor was beginning to crack, revealing insecurity beneath the polished surface. She had started making mistakes, small ones, but enough to undermine her credibility with our colleagues. Zoe, on the other hand, was overconfident. She thought she could bulldoze her way through the system, disregarding the experience of others. She was ambitious, but her rashness was clouding her judgment. I realized that if I played it right, I could use both of their flaws to my advantage. The first step of my comeback was subtle, offering Emma a chance to prove herself again. I scheduled a private meeting with her under the guise of discussing some ongoing projects. But it wasn't just about the work. I needed to rebuild the trust she had lost in me, to remind her that she still had value in this office, value I hadn't fully recognized before. I wasn't asking her to forget the past, but to see the potential in a future where we could work together, without the distraction of personal emotions. "You've always been an asset to this team, Emma," I said calmly as we reviewed some reports. "Your experience, your leadership, it's something I should have acknowledged more. I've been distracted." She looked at me, her expression guarded, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that suggested the possibility of reconciliation. That was all I needed. The seeds of doubt had already been planted in her mind, and now I had to nurture them. With Zoe, I had a different approach. Her energy was hard to ignore, but I knew she could be reckless if left unchecked. She needed guidance, not just from me, but from the right people in the office. I started to introduce her to more senior figures, those who could mentor her and provide the experience she lacked. Slowly, I worked behind the scenes to position her in a way that would make her realize that her raw ambition was only half of what was needed to succeed. She had the drive, but she lacked the patience and wisdom to truly understand the politics of the office. I became a quiet influence in her decisions, steering her away from the more extreme ideas she had. The more I worked with her, the more I saw a different side of Zoe, one that wasn't just about getting attention or proving herself. Beneath the impulsiveness was someone who was hungry for real mentorship. But it had to come from the right person. As the days passed, I carefully crafted a narrative in the office, subtly shifting the perception of both women. I didn't want to pit them directly against each other, but I did want them to see the value in cooperation. Emma had to realize that her place in the office wasn't threatened by a younger, less experienced employee, and Zoe needed to understand that there were greater forces at play than her own desires. I couldn't just make one of them the victor. I had to create an environment where both could rise, not at each other's expense, but together. And with that, I began preparing for the final confrontation. It was time to lay my cards on the table, to reveal my true strength, not by brute force, but through careful planning and deliberate actions. The showdown wouldn't be about dominance. It would be about balance, how to regain control in a way that was satisfying, but also fair. The office felt different that day. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone knew something was about to shift. The usual hum of activity seemed quieter, as if people were holding their breath. I could sense it. Both Emma and Zoe were on edge, their simmering emotions barely hidden behind professional facades. They knew the time had come, too. I called a meeting, one that would change everything. It wasn't just another casual discussion of ongoing projects. It was a final reckoning. A moment where I would no longer be the pawn in their game. This time, I would control the board. Emma arrived first, her usual grace tinged with the sharpness of someone on the defensive. Zoe followed, her youthful arrogance barely concealed beneath her polished exterior. I watched them both as they took their seats, the unspoken tension crackling in the room. There was no need for pleasantries. They knew why they were here. "I've been observing you both for some time now," I began, my voice steady and calm. "And I've come to a conclusion. This office, this team, isn't just about individual success. It's about collaboration, about working together to achieve something greater." Both of them stiffened, but I could see the subtle shift in their expressions. Emma's eyes flicked toward Zoe, and Zoe's gaze hardened but lingered on me, as if trying to read my next move. "I understand that both of you have different strengths," I continued, "but you've allowed personal rivalry to cloud your judgment. What was once a competitive spark has become a destructive force." There was a beat of silence before Emma spoke, her voice a little more brittle than usual. "You're saying we've been, what? Distracting you?" "It's not just about me," I replied, locking eyes with her. "It's about the entire team. The energy here is fractured, and it's affecting everything. The work, the clients, the relationships. And while I've been passive, I can't afford to stay silent any longer." Zoe's lip curled slightly, but she bit her tongue. I could tell she was itching to speak, but I wasn't done yet. "The fact is," I said, shifting my gaze between the two women, "neither of you are as secure as you think. Emma, your influence is waning. You've become too predictable, and that's a weakness in a place like this. Zoe, your ambition is blinding you. You're good, but you're reckless, and that will eventually catch up with you." Both women looked like they had been slapped. The tension in the room tightened, and for the first time, I saw real vulnerability in their eyes. They were both used to having the upper hand, used to being the ones who controlled the narrative, but now the script was in my hands. "I'm not here to take sides," I continued, "but I am here to tell you both something very important." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "If you continue down this path, you will both lose. Not just the respect of your colleagues, but your chance to truly lead, to make an impact. And I won't sit idly by while that happens." Emma's shoulders tensed, but she said nothing. Zoe, on the other hand, seemed to bristle at my words. "What are you suggesting? That we just forget everything and pretend we're all friends now?" I met her challenge head on. "No. What I'm suggesting is that you both realize that the office doesn't revolve around petty rivalry or egos. It revolves around results. And if you can't focus on that, if you can't put your differences aside for the greater good, then you'll be out. All of you." The room was silent now, each word hanging heavily in the air. I could feel the shift. Both Emma and Zoe were starting to understand. This wasn't about me playing them against each other. This was about forcing them to face the reality of their own behavior and its consequences. "I've been patient with you both," I said, my voice softer now. "But I'm done waiting. This office deserves better, and it's time for both of you to prove you're worthy of the positions you hold." There was a long pause. Emma, to my surprise, was the first to speak. Her voice was quieter now, but there was a note of humility in it. "You're right," she said, looking at me with a slight nod. "I've let this go too far. Maybe I've been a little blind." Zoe's expression softened, though she didn't look completely convinced. And you think we can just make it work? Just like that. I don't think it's about making it work, I replied. I think it's about acknowledging that you both have something to bring to the table. But only if you're willing to listen to each other, to put aside your egos and focus on what matters. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than competition in their eyes. Perhaps respect, perhaps understanding. The tension had not completely dissipated, but there was now a chance for something more productive. Emma glanced at Zoe, then back at me. Maybe we can try, she said, her voice cautious. Zoe was quieter than usual, her face betraying a mixture of frustration and reluctant agreement. Fine, but don't think this is over. I'll be watching. The confrontation had taken a turn I hadn't fully expected. I had assumed that one of them would rebel, that one would try to undermine the process. But here they were, acknowledging the possibility of cooperation. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was the beginning of one. And I realized that this was exactly what I needed: balance. Neither Emma nor Zoe had fully emerged victorious, but both were forced to confront their own flaws and understand the true meaning of leadership. The power dynamic had shifted, and now they knew that I wasn't just the man they fought over. I was the one who had orchestrated the entire resolution. Weeks passed, and the atmosphere in the office was noticeably different. The storm that had once been brewing between Emma and Zoe had settled into something quieter, more professional. The constant tension, the rivalry, had given way to something resembling mutual respect, or at least acceptance. Emma no longer tried to undermine Zoe's every move, and Zoe had begun to temper her impulsiveness. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As for me, I felt the shift as well. The drama, the competition, the chaos. It was no longer my burden to carry. I had managed to walk that tightrope, to turn the table in my favor without making enemies, without creating lasting damage. My reputation had been solidified, not just as someone who could navigate the politics of the office, but as someone who could command respect and balance power. One morning, Emma stopped by my office. I'd expected a simple project update, but what came next surprised me. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice softer than usual. "You were right about everything. I didn't want to admit it at first, but, well, I'm glad you pushed us to change." I looked up from my desk, surprised at the vulnerability in her words. "It wasn't about pushing you, Emma. It was about making sure we were all focused on the same goal. The office needed balance, and so did we." She nodded, a slight smile forming on her lips. "I think we're getting there. Slowly, but we are." There was no grand apology, no dramatic speech, just a simple acknowledgement of the truth. It wasn't the closure I'd initially imagined, but it was more satisfying than I expected. Emma wasn't the type to show weakness, but here, in this quiet moment, she was acknowledging her own flaws. That spoke volumes to me. Later that week, Zoe approached me after a particularly intense meeting. She'd been quieter than usual, almost contemplative. "You were right," she said, looking me square in the eyes. "I was too focused on the wrong things. I got carried away thinking I had to prove something. But it's not just about ambition. It's about knowing when to push and when to pull back." Her words were blunt, but there was a sincerity in them that hadn't been there before. It felt like the first real conversation we'd had since all this started. "You're learning," I said with a nod. "It's a process, but you're on the right path." Zoe gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Thanks. For everything." The final act of vindication wasn't the public apology I might have expected from both women. It wasn't a dramatic showdown or a victory lap. It was in the quiet acknowledgement of growth, the recognition that the power dynamics had shifted in the office, and that, for once, it wasn't just about who could outshine the other. It was about collaboration, understanding, and mutual respect. And me? I had won in a way I hadn't expected. Not through brute force or manipulation, but through patience and strategic thinking. I had regained control, not just of the office, but of my own life and choices. The women who once fought for my affection had realized that what truly mattered wasn't winning my attention. It was earning respect, both from me and from their peers. The tension that had once been so thick in the office had melted away, replaced by a sense of unity and purpose. The whole team felt more aligned, more focused on the goals that mattered, and I was at the helm of it all, still the man in the middle, but no longer a pawn in anyone's game. And when the end of the quarter rolled around, the results spoke for themselves. The office had exceeded expectations, the team had come together in ways no one had thought possible, and the air had cleared. Emma and Zoe were no longer rivals. They were colleagues, peers, and each had their own place in the dynamic I had quietly orchestrated. As I stood in the conference room, looking at the results, I realized just how much this experience had taught me. It wasn't about being the most dominant force in the room. It was about knowing when to push and when to step back. It was about understanding people, not just situations. It was about patience, strategy, and knowing that sometimes the quietest victories were the most satisfying. I had won not through confrontation, but through clarity, and I was at peace with it.